Well, thank you very much, Nathan, and thanks to you. It's great to be back in Rochester Diocese, which is where it all began for me quite a long time ago, although not here in Walderslade. I think it's probably necessary to begin with a few words about what social theology is, because it's not a term that's in everyday use in the Church of England. In a nutshell, it's about how our beliefs and our understanding of God's purposes work out in terms of the kind of world we want to see and how we should go about living well together. So it's about more than our faith individually. It's got a dimension that's about politics, small p, in the sense of how we compromise together, how we live with difference, how we deal with different understandings of what a good society would be. It's social in the sense that it is about how our beliefs as Christians reflect in the way we order society. Not just about how we live with our neighbours around us in an immediate community, but how we think of ourselves as part of a much bigger thing called society. And of course it's got a global dimension, because you can't do any of that without thinking about how we sit within the world as a whole. Now, many people will know a great deal more about the Roman Catholic tradition, known as Catholic social teaching, or among Catholics it's often abbreviated to CST. Catholic social teaching is something that has been part of Roman Catholic Church life for a very long time. And it reflects the way in which the Catholic Church does theology. It starts usually with the great papal encyclicals and the things that successive popes have said about the nature of society in this world and how our beliefs in God's purposes should shape our society. And then those encyclicals are worked over by theologians, by people who are active in local communities and so on, until they develop a whole school of thinking about what it means to be a Christian and what it means to be a church within society. Catholic social teaching is fairly well known. The Anglican version, perhaps less so. And many Anglicans, of course, draw their inspiration and their comfort even from all sorts of sources, and Catholic social thought is one of those. So the Roman Catholic tradition has actually fed and nurtured Anglicans for a long time. And one of the key things about the Catholic tradition is what's known as virtue ethics. Thinking about how we should be and how we should behave and how we should order society through the prism of the great virtues. Virtues like prudence, courage, and so on. What it means to be a good person isn't just for each one of us, but being a good person plays out in the way in which we relate to each other socially. Now, the Anglican tradition has its own way of looking at some of those things, but I think the best way of taking you inside that Anglican tradition is to talk a little bit about its history. And the Church of England, or Anglicanism, really only came into existence in its recognisable form in the 16th and 17th centuries as a result of the way in which we uniquely, I think, in this country tried to resolve the tension between the Catholic way of doing things and the Reformation way of doing things. I'll say a bit more about that later. But the tradition of social theology really only comes into its own at the point where society and politics seems to be moving away from church and Christianity. So you're looking here towards the end of the 19th century, when people start feeling that religion is more of an optional extra than a core value at the heart of everything that they are and everything they do. Once you begin to get that separation with the growth of the sciences and the scientific way of looking at things, an increasing sense that the ancient texts of the Bible don't speak to modern society, industrial, urban societies that grew up in the 19th century. Once you get that gap, then the church has to do some work to build a bridge. Until that point, when being a Christian is as natural as eating, sleeping and breathing, that work doesn't feel so necessary. So you're looking towards the end of the 19th century. You have social reformers like Charles Kingsley, like F.D. Maurice, people who from within the Christian tradition are trying to say the way in which our society in this country has gone with the Industrial Revolution, with the growth of cities, the growth of poverty, and the way in which people are now becoming hands rather than persons, simply they're hired to do a job which could be done by almost anybody. In all these ways, we're falling short of a Christian vision of what a good society might be. But the Anglican thinking on society really comes into its own after the First World War. That, I think, was the great cataclysm. I mean, we're nearly all wearing our poppies today. It's 100 years ago, isn't it? I mean, this is very much on our minds at the moment. But that great cataclysm of the First World War, I think, shocked our society and most Western societies to their core. How can we stop this ever happening again? What has gone so wrong that whole Christian societies like Britain, Germany, France can tear themselves apart like this? How come both sides can invoke God's support and yet mass slaughter on this scale is what followed? So you can imagine that by 1918, the whole focus of the church, or a very large part of it, is what went wrong? What went wrong with our understanding of how our faith shapes society, that this could happen? And the key figure in England, emerging after the First World War, is the figure of William Temple. He was a young, rather precocious clergyman. He was the son of an Archbishop of Canterbury. He went on to be Bishop of Manchester, Archbishop of York, and then Archbishop of Canterbury himself. And he was perhaps the best known Archbishop of Canterbury in terms of ordinary people believing that he cared for them. And Temple in the 20s, in the early days after the First World War, tried to work towards a new understanding of how Christian theology sat alongside all those other sorts of knowledge coming out of the sciences, the humanities generally, economic understanding, and so on. And his method, instead of the way in which the church had tended to work beforehand, and still did for a long time, of simply opining from a great height, as if this is what God wants, and you know it's up to you to put it into practice. He started to do a great deal more listening, and his style was to convene big conferences, one at Oxford towards the end of the 20s, and various others, where he brought together people who epitomized those different understandings of the world. So scientists, economists, people from the world of politics, people from the world of literature. And you look at the list of the people who attended these conferences and you see names like T.S. Eliot, Dorothy Sayers, who you may think of as a detective story writer, but was a very able lay theologian too. And so Temple was using the convening power of the church, the power of the church to draw people together in, as it were, a safe space to talk about what sort of a world should we be working for. And then, of course, in the late 20s and early 30s, you get the Depression. You get the breaking of the old economic consensus, the sense that the way we do business, the way we run industry and so on, is the best of all possible worlds. You get mass unemployment. And in the 30s, the response to that in the rise of totalitarianisms, particularly Hitler, Mussolini, Franco in Europe. And I think in those years of the 30s, you have something of the same sense of uncertainty and fear, the same sense that all our old certainties are on the bonfire, as we have now in a world after the referendum and after the election of Donald Trump. We don't know how these things are going to work out for us. History never repeats itself exactly, but that same sense that what we thought was certain is not certain anymore. And so, although I've talked about Anglican social theology on many occasions, this week is the time when I really have to rethink this and start again in some respects. Almost the most wonderful thing about Temple's work, the sign of the most intense faith, was the conference he called at Malvern in 1941. Now just cast your mind back. I don't suppose there's many here who remember 1941. But 1941, we've won the Battle of Britain, but things are still extremely nervous. As the conference is being planned through 1940, America still hasn't joined the war. The great turning points of El Alamein and the successes in the desert haven't yet happened. The idea that Britain might yet, very soon, be under the jackboot of Hitler is still very, very intense. And at that moment, Temple convenes a conference to say, what kind of a society are we trying to build after this war, once it's over? That, for me, having heard about Malvern over many years, suddenly that sense of where it sat in history makes it all the more intense. That at that moment, when everything stood in the balance, people were casting their minds forward. How are we going to deal with things when we've won? An amazing act of faith. And the Malvern Conference, although like all conferences, you can get almost anything you like out of it when you read the account of what people have said. William Temple had this amazing gift of writing the minutes. If ever you want to influence history, get to be the minutes secretary, especially for a conference. He was able to write these things up in a way that gave an impression of a considerable consensus that might not have been there in the first place. But all the same, it made a difference. These were conferences where people from the world of politics attended, people from the world of universities, different areas of knowledge and so on. But it came out, the fruits of it to a great extent, came out in this little penguin, William Temple's famous book, Christianity and Social Order. And in a sense, this is the moment where Anglican social theology is crystallized for the 20th century. Now, it's a very, very slim book, 90 pages in Penguin. The bit I like about it best, it came out in 1942, is this note at the bottom, which I think went into most Penguins at the time. It says, "Leave this book at a post office when you have read it, so that men and women in the services may enjoy it too." Now, this book sold literally hundreds of thousands of copies. And if people actually obeyed that and left it in the post office so that soldiers, sailors, airmen got to read it, you can imagine that it had an impact way beyond the number of people who purchased it. Just to give you a kind of comparison, the first book I wrote, I start getting royalties after the first 300 copies have been sold. It came out in 2004, and I haven't had a penny. So even a fairly, successful theological book these days might sell 2,000 or 3,000. Temple hit a nerve, and he hit a moment in our history, I think, where the church, and particularly the Church of England, was understood to have something worth saying. There'd been a lot of cynicism about the church and about Christianity and religion through the 1930s. If you read that great history of the 30s by Malcolm Muggeridge, called The 30s, you would be hard put to say that the church was anywhere. What he did say about the churches was cynical. It's just dying out, it'll soon be gone. So if you hear that again, incidentally, that we're all declining so fast we'll soon be gone, they've been saying it for quite a long time. Going back to 1942, do you remember the 1990 in this case, the comment by John Major about old maids bicycling through the mists to Holy Communion? Well, he was quoting an essay by George Orwell, also from 1942, and I'm telling you, they were not the same old ladies. The Church of England does have an ability to reproduce itself in every generation, but it also has the ability to get anxious about itself in every generation too. That's by way of a sideline. Christianity and Social Order was an extraordinarily influential book, partly because Temple was an extremely well-connected person. British society was a bit like that, I suspect, in those days. For instance, he ran the text past Maynard Keynes, the great economist, to say, is there anything here that an economist would object to? Have I got it right? He knew R.H. Tawney, the great economic historian, and they corresponded. He was a particular friend of William Beveridge, the architect of our welfare state. And so you can see some very strong lines of connection between Temple's theological thought, in which he tried to locate the church as setting the moral tone for the nation, and then the way it worked out after the war. So you see this progression from Malvern, a conference asking, what are we going to do when the war's over, to the book, to the welfare state report of Beveridge, to the welfare state that we got after the war. And indeed, it was Temple who coined the phrase welfare state. He didn't quite mean the Beveridge report because that hadn't been written. What he meant was, what do we have to offer that's better than what the totalitarians, Hitler, Mussolini, and so on, are offering? Hitler talked about the power state. I think he got it from Mussolini, but it was certainly one of Hitler's phrases. The power state is justified by the way in which it uses power to expand its territory and to fight for its citizens over against all comers. It was simply the naked exercise of power. This, said Temple, you cannot do as a Christian. This is not a Christian way of ordering society or living out politics. But what alternative was there? If you looked back to the 30s and the economic system that had gone so terribly wrong in the crash, a sort of laissez-faire, where the government tried to minimize its involvement in people's lives, let the market do all the work, that wasn't going to solve anything either. So Temple tried to find a way between those two, and in contrast to Hitler's power state, he talked about the welfare state. In other words, the state is justified in the eyes of Christians. In other words, we give up some of our freedoms to the state because the state's objective is to maximize the welfare of all the citizens. So that's what he meant by a welfare state. The state is something that, I mean, there's nothing in the Bible that says Christians should immediately pay homage to the modern nation state. He says, but we ought to, provided the state sets out to build our welfare as a people. Now, that, as you can imagine, was a way of thinking that influenced the church and indeed British society for many years after the war. Temple died suddenly in office in 1944, but as it were, a good man can't be kept down, and his way of doing social theology and thinking about the church in society continued for a very long time. But like all traditions, it became tired. And it's worth thinking why such a vibrant and powerful way of thinking gets tired and doesn't quite answer the questions anymore. First of all, his idea was the church and theologians sitting down with other experts. So you can imagine it was what we would nowadays call a rather elitist model. You got to sit in the conference if you were an expert in something. It didn't really hear the voices of those who were perhaps victims of the Depression, except those who perhaps had studied the victims of the Depression at one remove. It was rather male, as you can imagine. It still would be, I suspect, but in those days it was very male indeed. One of the little stories that makes me treat Temple as rather less than a total saint is that he turned up for one of the planning meetings of one of the conferences at Cuddesdon Theological College. And Cuddesdon in those days would not admit women, not just not as students, just not at all. And one of Temple's group was a wonderful lay theologian called Maud Royden. And the principal of Cudson said, oh, no, we can't be having women here, you know. And Temple, to his eternal shame, really, turned around and said, I'm sorry, Maud, the next train back to London's in half an hour. So even our saints have occasional flaws. But it was a very male way of doing theology, as you can imagine. It assumed that the theologian would take his seat among all the other disciplines as an equal. It didn't take very long into the 50s and 60s before that became much more problematic. People would recognise the authority of an economist, political scientist, natural scientist, much more readily than they would acknowledge the expertise and the authority of a theologian. During the 90s, I used to organise an international conference every year in Mulheim in Germany of theologians from around Europe, East and West, meeting with economists to try and think theologically about economics. It was very noticeable that all the theologians were dead keen to listen to the economists, but when the theologians were talking, the economists either looked bored or absented themselves. There wasn't the same sense that theology was an important discipline, because it didn't have numbers in it, I suppose. Well, the book of numbers, you know what I mean. It wasn't a mathematical thing, it wasn't scientific, it was pretty hypothetical, I suppose. So theology gradually got pushed to the margins while everyone else talked. And you can see this in the way in which the predecessor of my own department at Church House used to issue reports during the 60s and 70s about social issues, work or family life or whatever, where there was a lot of very eminent discussion of the science or the sociology or whatever it was. Then there would be the rather banal theological chapter tacked on the end, which didn't seem to change anything very much. And frankly, you could skip it without losing any of the sense of the report. Theology became marginalised, just as the church was being marginalised socially. Temple had always argued that the church not only has a right to speak about society, politics and economics and so on, but it must do it if it's to be true to its vocation. He talked about the idea of the separation between church and politics as a modern heresy in 1942. But as early as 1926, Temple had been one of a group of eminent churchmen who went to see Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to try to bring about the resolution of the miners' strike that went on beyond the general strike. And Stanley Baldwin turned around and said, how would you like it if I referred the Rethinking the Athanasian Creed to the Iron and Steel Trades Confederation? And that was widely acknowledged as closing the argument. You wouldn't expect the Iron and Steel Trades Confederation to meddle in the creed. Why should you meddle in my work? And that separation was taken as being entirely normal and natural. Temple argued vehemently that it wasn't. But it took more than argument at a time when the church and Anglican life was moving further and further away from the centre of the national consciousness. After the war, Temple's approach lived on. It relied on the fact, I think, that having sought to build a social consensus so that left and right both shared a view of what the state and government was about, this kind of theology only really flourished in the years of consensus. We, as the Anglican Church, had done quite a lot to build that consensus. The parties of left and right maintained it through the 50s and 60s to a great extent. None of them until quite late in the day began to think of dismantling Beveridge's welfare state. And so the role of the church as a kind of social commentator rolled on. It tended to be a bit semi-detached, frankly, and yet in those days the church still seemed to be somewhere near the heart of British life. Temple's work continued through some very, very important Anglican theologians. And I feel quite privileged, really, to stand in that line, almost like an apostolic succession, myself in a minor way, because one of my early influences was Professor Ronald Preston from Manchester. I only knew him in his retirement. He was a wonderful man. He, before the war, as a young man with the student Christian movement, had known Temple, worked with him, had known the great American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, and had studied. Ronald wasn't first and foremost a theologian. He started as an economist, studying economics at the London School of Economics under Tawney. Ronald, later, after the war, well, no, it was late as the 1970s, supervised a doctorate by John Atherton. John died earlier this year, wonderful theologian who wrote a doctorate about Tawney, supervised by Preston, and referring throughout to Temple. Somewhat later, John Atherton supervised my doctorate, which was looking at Temple, Preston, Tawney, and all of them, and the more contemporary philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre. So gradually, what's known as this Manchester School of Social Theology began to grow and develop. I think the great days were probably the 50s and 60s when Preston was at the height of his powers. And it handed on. It had a strong sense that, funnily enough, it was almost an accident that it happened in Manchester, but it did. And so Manchester, the north, old industrial cities became the subject matter in a way. These were the places, were like a laboratory for the church working out a new understanding of what a good society would be like. And an outfit called the William Temple Foundation that had been set up in memory of Temple was run, Ronald Preston was on its council of management for many years. David Jenkins, the former Bishop of Durham, who died only a few weeks ago, was one of its first directors. John Atherton followed him. I followed Atherton, and so on and so forth. It's still going strong, although it's moved to the University of Chester more recently. And all that sense that the urban context, the big old industrial cities were where we were forging a new understanding of church and state, meant that when things in society as a whole started falling to bits in the early 80s, then it was to that school of theology that many turned. And many people, of course, have marked the date of 1979 as a crucial turning point nationally and locally. Nationally, it was the first of Margaret Thatcher's governments, the first government since the war to say that the post-war consensus was over, to reaffirm the kind of economics that had been prevalent before the crash in the 30s. Globally, 1979 was also the year when the Ayatollah Khomeini came to power in Iran, and the whole balance of Christianity and Islam globally shifted in ways that I'm sure everyone here recalls. By the early 1980s, the impact of the economic policies of Margaret Thatcher's government were being felt in the deindustrialisation of our cities, in the rocketing unemployment, and in rioting for the first time in decades on the streets of Britain, in Toxteth, Brixton, Handsworth, and so on. And it was after those riots that a group of senior clergy went to see the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Runcie, and said, look, we have never seen anything like this before. All our certainties as a society, our relationships with one another are beginning to crumble. It's down to the church to offer a bit of moral leadership here, because we cannot go on like this. This is the way to ruin. Runcie was actually quite reluctant at first to do much about it. He was still feeling his way very carefully with Margaret Thatcher's government. It wasn't an easy relationship, and it got worse. But in the end, Runcie was persuaded to set up a commission to consider what was going on in the inner city and outer estate areas. And it came out in that famous report of 1985, Faith in the City. Striking, isn't it, how long ago that was? That's over 30 years. I remember it coming out. I was at the time in an inner city parish in Southampton. It was like a breath of air. What most people forget is that the first headlines, you know what happens, you put out a report, it's got dozens of recommendations, the journalists go whizzz, and the first thing they lighted on, and the first headline was, Church recommends the end of mortgage tax relief. And I was being buttonholed on the street by people in the parish saying, "Your church wants to take away my mortgage tax relief," as if that was the only thing that it had said. But the fascinating thing about Faith in the City was that it didn't stick with the old William Temple Anglican tradition of doing theology. The theological chapter was very odd. It drew instead on the Latin American tradition of liberation theology, theology from below. What would theology look like if it was done by the people living on the estates or in the inner cities, rather than by Temple's chums from public schools sitting around in their conferences? Now, I think time has shown that that approach didn't translate very easily from little villages in El Salvador where people were all faithful Catholics living under the threat of death squads to even the riot-torn streets of our inner cities. The context was much, much different. Nonetheless, this was what got the report branded as Marxist theology, which made it sell like hotcakes. So yet again, the Church of England, in doing its social theology, had hit on a bestseller by accident. No, if you read Faith in the City now, it feels 30 years old, let's be honest. But it really did put the cat among the pigeons, and for a long time the Church of England was rather hopefully branded as the unofficial opposition. We were probably doing a better job of articulating a more Christian understanding of society than certainly any of the opposition parties were doing. It didn't make us any friends in government, unfortunately. But gradually, it became clear that liberation tradition, that liberative theology, was going to be very hard to translate into a British context. The Church of England, however much at the time we may have wanted it to, was never going to become a church of the poor in the same way that the Catholic Church in places like El Salvador was. It wasn't going to be a church that neglected the rich and the middle classes and was run for and by the most marginal in society. We were always going to be the church that tried to reach out but were not transformed totally. I shall in a moment mention more about a current thinker, Maurice Glassman. Maurice is a Labour peer, he's an academic, he's the founder of the movement that these days is known as Blue Labour. But Maurice has this wonderful story about the Labour movement in this country. He says, the thing is, the Labour Party has completely forgotten that it really is a Christian project. But it's not a simple Christian project, he says. It's the result of an unhappy marriage between a Catholic or Free Church father and an Anglican mother. And he tells the story like this. He says, the Catholics and the Free Churches in this country right through into the middle of the 20th century knew themselves to be outsiders. And for instance, when the London dockers struck against intolerable conditions, the then Cardinal marched with them, the Salvation Army band came behind them, but the Church of England didn't. It says the Anglican mother is quite well to do, but wants to do good. And so you have these two strands within the Labour movement, he says, of the force from below that knows that you have to organise to get anywhere, and the benevolent person who wants to help others. And he says this is quite an unhappy marriage, but actually, unless the Labour Party remembers again that it's a Christian project, it'll never resolve all that. That's sort of by way of a parenthesis, really. The reception that Faith in the City got frightened us, I think. It certainly frightened George Carey. In 1997, the churches together in Britain were going to produce another report on unemployment. This was, if you remember, the end of John Major's regime. And George tried very hard to crush it and say this is not going to be published just before an election. The last thing he wanted was to get up the noses of the next Conservative administration. He didn't manage to crush it because it wasn't an Anglican project, really. It was in the name of all the churches, even though the Church of England had put up most of the money and done most of the work. And it came out And funnily enough, it fell completely flat. And this goes to show that sometimes the way we speak theologically to the world is dependent on circumstance. It was actually quite a good report. The problem was that the Conservatives had more or less made up their minds they were going to lose the election. Gordon Brown thought it was a jolly good report because it reflected a lot of his ideas, and the Conservatives put up Peter Lilly, who simply said what a splendid report it was and didn't go on the attack. The Daily Telegraph obviously hadn't got the message from central office because it ran pure communism from the Church of England as its headline, but that wasn't the official message. And unfortunately, because it didn't stir up any controversy, it fell like a stone, which was a great shame because it had some good things to say about employment and unemployment. But to cut more to the present, because I think the present is where the interesting stuff is now happening. In 2008, we had the most recent crash. And I now look back at a paper I prepared for the General Synod, which had a big debate about the implications of the crash. I can't believe how naive I was in just not recognizing that all sorts of things would change. I don't think anyone knew how much would change until very recently indeed, but in 2008 we were still thinking in terms of it's going to be tough for some of the northern cities, it's going to be a bit socially divisive. We had no sense, I had no sense, that some of our basic foundations were going to be shaken. But to their credit, some of the bishops in urban and northern dioceses realised that the church was once again going to be in the firing line, that whatever the effects of another recession, a lot of people in this country were already on the borderline between just getting by and not getting by. They were largely in their diocese, and the church would be the first port of call for people who had nothing, as has of course been proved with the rise of food banks and other similar projects. And the bishops got together and said, what we need is a teaching document from the House of Bishops to reaffirm the project of Anglican social theology, to teach members of the Church of England that getting involved, that thinking about society theologically, putting their faith to work to build a better world, that this is actually part of our vocation as disciples. And they wanted it on two sides of A4. I don't mean that they immediately thought they wanted two sides of A4, but that's what a teaching document would be. It would be something that could really be read in the course of a service. And I'm afraid, as the person who they turned to write this, I said, it ain't going to happen. There's no way in a church that in its own way is as divided as the nation that we're going to be able to pull that together. And I remember a meeting of a committee of bishops where they were humming and hawing over this, and the Bishop of London, Richard Chartres, in his usual sort of rather de haut en basse style, said, well, why don't we just send Malcolm away to see what he can come up with, and if we like it, we can adopt it. So that was my job, go and pull something together on Anglican social theology. It was a fascinating project, and it came out as this book a couple of years ago called You Won't Be Surprised to See Anglican Social Theology. It's a collection of half a dozen essays. It pulls them together. My old friend Alan Suggett, who is he's a retired academic from Durham, probably the living greatest authority on William Temple, writing about the Temple tradition. John Hughes, who was probably one of our most promising young theologians. He was Dean of Jesus College, Cambridge. He wrote about the state of that tradition today. Very sadly, he was killed in a car accident on the day the book came out, which was a massive loss for Anglican theology. Very, very clever, promising, and unlike some clever people, one of the nicest guys you could meet. A very important chapter from a friend called Jonathan Chaplin, who runs a think tank, theological think tank in Cambridge. Jonathan is an evangelical and works in that tradition. And this was tremendously important because evangelicals had always tended to sit light to the temple tradition. They'd always been rather nervous of the concept of salvation by works rather than faith, and were afraid that social theology was preaching that you could be saved by action rather than by belief. That's really disappeared, I think. In my Southampton days, when Faith in the City came out and I was developing unemployed people's projects and worker cooperatives and all sorts of things in the inner city areas, our evangelical colleagues would say, no, dodgy, faith, it's faith, not works. I've never heard that now, just don't hear it. Evangelicals in the Church of England today are among the most active, imaginative and energetic in terms of engaging with the society we have. What they've not done, on the whole, is very much theological thinking about it. Now, part of my response to the bishops who asked for this book was to say it's important because the reason Anglican social theology really didn't come to very much during the 90s and early 2000s was because we had stopped thinking about it as a theological tradition. We had just got on with doing. And we could no longer give a coherent account of why we were doing the things we were doing. In the mid-80s, as I say, I was in Southampton, massive unemployment in the city, and we were running all kinds of projects, youth training schemes, small business setups and all kinds of things. And I had a kind of gut sense that this was a Christian vocation, but I would have had a great deal of difficulty putting it into words. None of my theological training had equipped me to do this, which is when I took up a bit of postgraduate work to try and work out what on earth I was doing, and went on from that to make that my academic specialism. And the fourth essay in the book, apart from my topping and tailing, is by a Roman Catholic theologian called Anna Rowlands, who is fascinating because although she's a Catholic theologian, she taught at an Anglican theological college. She's married to an Anglican priest. So she understands both traditions. She entitled her chapter Catholic Social Teaching and Anglican Social Theology, Fraternal Traditions, ? And that's a wonderful title because she meant fraternal traditions in the sense that we have a lot in common. She also noted that it's mostly done by men, still. And I take this as a slight rebuke because my original lineup of authors for the book was entirely male. And the bishop sent a note back saying, doesn't Malcolm know any girls? So Anna came in on the project and served us extremely well. But what we're exploring in the book was how things have changed since Temple's time. First of all, the sheer marginalisation of religious belief. The big turning point here was 2001 and the 9/11 attacks, when we discovered that most of the Western world doesn't have the vocabulary to talk sensibly about religions. And as far as the response to militant Islam goes, much of the response has been to lump all religion together as if it is religion that's the problem, rather than particular manifestations of it. In my present job, where I have quite a lot to do with government departments, I have sometimes imagined to myself that every civil servant is issued with a wall chart. This isn't true, it's just a fantasy, but they talk as if they have a wall chart with all the great world faiths along the bottom and all the bizarre behaviours up the other axis, the strange dress codes, the food regulations, the weird sexual practices and so on, or non-practices. And so they can read off as a kind of ready reckoner. So because people are very conscious that Islam has a dress code, particularly for women, we got ourselves into all sorts of knots about people wearing crosses. Are they offensive or are they a basic human right? Now, one of the first things I had to do in this job was write a brief for the Archbishop of York when there was a news case about a young girl who had adopted the American thing of the silver ring, the chastity ring. Girls were wearing a silver ring to show that they intended to stay virgins until they were married. And this girl had got into trouble at school because they had a no jewellery policy, and she treated that as an infringement of her religious rights. And I was asked to write, what should the Archbishop say about this? And I'm not very good at quoting Bible texts, but I gave him one, and it was from Matthew's Gospel about, woe to you who do your piety in public, you have had your reward already. I got a reply back from my boss that said, yes, but the Archbishop wants to support this, so we have got to as well. Which was my first real introduction into what it meant to be a church civil servant. You don't always make the policy, you sometimes have to give a jolly good justification for the policy that's already been decided. But that's true, but I was right, wasn't I, really? Christians don't have dress codes, we don't have rules that say you must wear a cross or you're somehow not a proper Christian. We support religious freedom. It's a religious freedom issue, it's not a religious necessity for Christians. We don't have dietary codes in the same way that Jews do, and so on and so forth. You cannot read off from one religion to another, but there's a very common perception that you can. We also live in a much more divided society, a society that's fragmented in all sorts of ways, and this is where it gets down to some quite deep stuff that we lived for a long time with a kind of individualism that really treats my ideas as must be just as good as yours. Yours must be just as good as mine. There is no sense of consensus that says, actually, as human beings, we do agree about quite a lot. And that plays out in the multi-faith context where there's a common belief that if you put people of different faiths in a room and lock the door, they'll kill each other. They're much more likely to plot together on how to escape and deal with the people who've dealt with them like that. We built on Anglican social theology with another report, which you may have seen. It came out just before the last general election from the House of Bishops, called Who is My Neighbour? And this was the first time the bishops have ever addressed a general election. It's the first time, of course, that we ever knew when the date of a general election would be so far in advance, because David Cameron had passed the Fixed Term Parliament Act. So the bishops were able to write something quite substantial. And the line, I did the drafting, they then commented, I did some more drafting, they commented again, and round we went. That's how these things go. But the line we were trying to take was that there have been two governments since the war that have changed the way we think about ourselves. Attlee's government of 1945 that brought in the welfare state, and Margaret Thatcher's government of 1979 that rebalanced, we can now see with the hindsight, rebalanced things back towards individual responsibility, enterprise, and so on. And we were arguing it's time for a third government that will change the way we think about ourselves. It wasn't on offer at the 2015 general election. What we were asking for or suggesting was the right way forward in the light of Anglican social theology was a government that would try to make ordinary communities flourish, that would be less statist than the Labour programme, but more interventionist than the Conservatives, that would try to make common acts of neighbourliness normal, instead of passing laws that tended to people understanding themselves as simply individuals who treated other people as strangers. We asked, are we fundamentally a society of strangers or a community of communities? And we went on from there. It got quite an interesting reception. Conservative Central Office decided to do the usual demolition job. The protocol is we send one of these to party leaders just before it's published, which with hindsight wasn't the right thing to do. Conservative Central Office took a few lines out of context, sent them to the Daily Mail and the Daily Express and did an absolute demolition job. They neglected the fact that most of the report, there'll be one paragraph pointing out one view and another pointing out the opposite. It'll be praising one left, praising right, criticising left, criticising right. So of course there was plenty of meat for them if they chose things selectively. But many others, more thoughtful politicians, welcomed it. Norman Tebbit said to one of the bishops in the House of Lords, I picked it up, it was quite good. The director of a very right-wing think tank, who I know fairly well, emailed me and said, I had expected to hate it, but I rather enjoyed it. We had some tremendous support from one or two Labour voices as well. I had the most amazing voicemail on my answer phone, but It was quite unprintable, but it was very enthusiastic from a particular politician. And fascinatingly, the themes here are reflected in some of the best developments in politics today. These are not the developments that you see trumpeted around. They're not the developments that will please the Guardian or the Daily Mail particularly. But if you look at the way in which some in the Conservative Party are trying to rethink their programme, it has a lot of this in it. It's a return to what they would call one nation conservatism. Michael Gove, of all people, gave a speech around the time of the general election, launching a project which he called the Good Right. The Archbishop of Canterbury said there are a lot of points in that are very similar to this. Why don't you produce a document with your points down one side and Michael Gove's down the other? And I did, and the great thing was that Gove had said them in half as many words, because this was criticised widely for being too verbose. On the left, Maurice Glassman, who I mentioned earlier, the whole Blue Labour movement, in a party that is still tearing itself to pieces in many respects, is beginning to build this new politics. Maurice is about the only person I know in politics who unashamedly uses the word love. We have to bring love back into the way we understand politics. And so he's trying to move from the economic liberalism of successive governments since 1979, which treated us all as isolated economic agents, and the social liberalism of the Blair and Brown governments that looked at questions of identity politics but didn't really see us as working within the economy as a whole. For instance, Harriet Harman's equality bill, I couldn't believe that they were producing an equality bill that said nothing about money. It was about gender, marital status, disability, race, and so on. It said nothing about money. Is it any wonder that people are disillusioned from those two sorts of liberal politics that divide us from one another and say nothing about the things we have in common? The problem we have with, to some extent, Brexit, to a great extent with Trump, are that what people have voted against is increasingly clear, but the things they have voted for are most unlikely to deliver. That's the tragedy we're in. And the challenge we have, and it is a heck of a challenge, is to rebuild that kind of politics where ordinary neighbourliness becomes the normal way of living together. When we take down the suspicion of each other, where we remove the way in which every relationship is understood either as a contract or a legal battle, and where we, as Maurice Glassman says, introduce love again into our political discourse. It's not a project for which there's an immediate manifesto, and it will be very, very interesting to see what happens on both sides of the Atlantic in the next few years. It could be very frightening indeed, as people discover how they have been misled. But if at the same time that political liberalism that Hillary Clinton stood for, that Blair, Brown, Major, even David Cameron stood for, if that has been undermined, we have a chance. We have a chance of rebuilding our communities as places where people get on with living, rather than seeing ourselves simply as individuals all on our own. The most recent piece of writing I've done for the bishops, which was not put out with a great splash because it wasn't the right moment, but they asked for a paper on welfare. And this is available on the Church of England website. It's called Thinking Afresh About Welfare. But the challenge for me in this came when the bishops they had a big seminar with all the bishops looking at the Scottish referendum and the forthcoming European referendum. And they were addressed by Lord Peter Hennessy. And Peter's a Catholic, political scientist who wrote the history of the welfare state. He's also very good on constitutional issues. But in the coffee break, he and the Archbishop of Canterbury and I were chatting, and Peter said, you know, the only reason the Beveridge Report in the 1940s took off was because at the last minute he was persuaded to add the first chapter, all the stuff about the 5 giant evils of want, ignorance, and unemployment, and so on. He said if he hadn't written that, it would have bombed. And of course, what he was doing was channeling John Bunyan. He said, it's only the churches, said Peter Hennessy, that have the moral authority to write in that tone of voice today. Oh, good, said Justin. I've just asked Malcolm to write something on welfare. Let's see if he can rewrite the first chapter of Beveridge for the 21st century. Well, I don't claim that I've achieved that. But I thought Beveridge was a nonconformist, a liberal. He naturally reached out to John Bunyan, a radical dissenter. I'm an Anglican. So I wrote the paper around that famous poem of John Donne, No man is an island entire of himself. And the paper subtitle is The Enemy Isolation, trying to pin down what it is that's breaking up our society today. The sense that we are all on our own, that the bonds between us don't matter and don't need nurturing, and that in the end, the politics of isolation is of despair on the one hand and fear on the other. If we can combat the enemy isolation, which after all is what churches do more than anything else in our society, we may have a chance. And I think it's a noble vocation in potentially very dark times. Thank you.